Now, let me return for a minute to this. Now, Heschel would often quote this as an example of the polarity between halakha and agadah and the polarity between law, namely it's forbidden to commit suicide, and ethics, which is that you shouldn't embarrass people in public. But this led him to a problem, a personal problem. And the personal problem was, what would he do, or what could he do, when he wanted to embarrass somebody in public? Or when somebody deserved to be embarrassed in public? What would he do? And the answer is, he would ask your permission. May I embarrass you? Or if it was something more severe, may I insult you? And then, or may I offend you? And then he would go ahead and do it. Because he was not the grandfatherly figure that many portrayed him as, especially in dealing with his students. And the closer you were, the harder he was on you. Let me give you a few examples. In the 1960s, before I get there, once Heschel was giving a lecture to a rabbinical school class. I was sitting in the class. And he was discussing this idea that I just mentioned before, the idea of the Shekhinah. The idea of what he calls, in his book on the prophets, the divine pathos. So this is an idea that, in his view, is rooted in the Bible, in the prophets, developed by the rabbis, and the idea of the Shekhinah, developed by the Kabbalists in their version of the idea of the Shekhinah, and developed further by the Hasidic masters, where you have a very personalized and almost tragic figure that we have to help out, namely the Shekhinah. This is not an omnipotent God. And if you read in Heschel's discussion I mentioned before to the principles of the Salman Schechter schools, in that same speech he points out that as far as he could see, the idea of an omnipotent God only came into Judaism in the Middle Ages through the influence of Islamic philosophy, and is not endemic to Judaism. So he was discussing this idea of the Shekhinah in a class, and one of the students in the class, I won't mention his name because he's today a very prominent rabbi, raised his hand and said, Dr. Heschel, I have a question. is this idea you're discussing of the Shekhinah, of the divine pathos, part of the mainstream of Jewish thought? Now, that was a very polite, in a way to put it, because just around that time, this is in the late 60s, there was a very prominent scholar here in Chicago. He later moved to Israel in Jewish thought, by the name of Eliezer Berkowitz. Some of you may have heard of him. And he had a thing about Heschel.
It's not in it.
It may have been jealousy, it may have been, they call him Kinat Sofrim, the rivalry of scholars. I'm not sure what it was, but he wrote a huge article in Tradition magazine, the magazine of the Orthodox rabbinate, on Heschel's view of divine pathos, in which he says that not only is this an idea that's not really authentically Jewish, but that it's an idea that is basically Christian. And that therefore Heschel's Heschel's theology is basically a Christian theology. And therefore no one should take it seriously. A rather nasty thing to say. So the student asked, is this idea of the Shekhinah, the divine pathos, part of the mainstream of Judaism? And so Heschel asked him his fatal question, may I embarrass you? The student said yes. And Heschel said to him, do you have a pencil? The student said yes. Do you have a piece of paper? The student said yes. He said, all right. Write on the piece of paper the word mainstream. Okay? He says, now, when you get home, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to the kitchen, turn on the stove, and throw the paper in the stove and burn it up. Because there is no such thing as a mainstream in Judaism. And the student says, what do you mean there's no such thing as a mainstream? We've always been taught that there is a mainstream. And Heschel said, no. He said, do you know where this idea that Judaism has a mainstream and who used this term in this context for the first time was? And the student said, no. And Heschel said, it was a very pious and friendly scholar at Harvard of early Judaism by the name of George Foot Moore, in his 3-volume work, Judaism in the First Centuries of the Christian Era, who was a very nice Protestant scholar who tried to make Judaism a dogmatic religion in the same way Christianity is. And therefore he needed a mainstream. So he argued that Judaism has certain ideas that are the mainstream. He said, but there isn't a mainstream, there are mainstream. And besides what Heschel considered the two mainstreams, which were basically the mystical and the rational, there were many tributary streams. He said, because if we only had a mainstream, it would be a very boring religion. It would be a monotone religion. So that's my example of may I embarrass you. Now, here's my example of may I insult you. In the 1960s, of course, the Vietnam War was going on. And one of the ways you could get out of the draft, because they were trying to draft just about everybody, was to study for the clergy, because then you had an exemption. You had what was called the 4D exemption. 4 was the best. 4F meant you were physically disabled. 4D meant you were exempt because you were studying divinity, as the Gentiles call it. And there were, believe it or not, Jewish boys who figured that their best bet is to become a rabbi rather than running around in the rice paddies over in Southeast Asia. So many people started applying for rabbinical school. And at that time, unlike today people get out of rabbinical school, like every students generally today, with a lot of debt. In those days, rabbinical schools didn't charge tuition. It was all based on endowments. And the Jewish Theological Seminary had a limited endowment, so they couldn't accept as many people as they otherwise might. So they decided to be very careful about the people they accepted, because they didn't have the money to support a lot of people, and because they didn't want to accept draft dodgers. It would be embarrassing. So they used to, at the admissions committees, really grill you over. It was a very grueling process to get in those days. And the Reform, they had their own grueling process. The Orthodox, another story. We'll get into that. So Heschel used to sit on the admissions committee of the rabbinical school. So a student would come in, and he would say to the student, suppose you're finished with your rabbinical studies and you're assigned for your first pulpit to go to Alaska, and you can take only one thing with you. What would you take? So of course all the students want to show how pious they are. So one says, I take a Shulchan Aruch. Another one says, I take the Psalms. Another one says, I take Tefillin. Another one says, I take a little Torah scroll. And Heschel would always say to them, may I embarrass you? And they would say, why? And he would say, wouldn't you take a coat? But then there was sometimes a student who would come and he would say to them, what does your father think about you becoming a rabbi? And once, this was more than once, but one time that I remember, a student, an applicant came in and he said, I'm doing this to get back at my father. I hate my father. He's everything I don't want to be. He's an atheist, and he's a communist, and he's a terrible person, and he's this, and he's that, and he cheats at business, and he's this and that. And Heschel says to him, may I insult you? And the student said, yes. He says, have you heard of a little-known statement in the Bible, honor your father? the end of that guy. Now let me move to another preliminary issue, which I call the manustana issue. How is this course different than other courses? Especially since most of you have already suffered through other courses with me. And I would say that one of the things that's different is that in all other courses, when I talk about significant Jewish thinker, like, say, Maimonides, or Judah of Prague, or Baal Shem Tov, or Rabbi Kiva, or any of these people, I have spent a lot of time studying their works, studying about them, thinking about what they had to say, but I never met any of them. I never knew any of them. I couldn't tell you how tall Maimonides was. I couldn't tell you what his voice sounded like. I couldn't tell you what his favorite drink was. I never met him. All I have are his writings and my own views of what he had to say and why. But when it comes to Heschel, I'm talking about somebody who I knew rather well. And with whom I was in a relationship which I think is unfortunately not as common today as it should be, and that is the master-disciple relationship. You're not even allowed to use these terms anymore. They're politically incorrect because they suggest one is higher than the other. But I'll use it anyway. And throughout centuries of Jewish learning, when you ask somebody, when you ask the scholar who they were, they would identify themselves by who they studied with, by who their teachers were. And while a teacher could have many students and many disciples, a disciple could only have one master. I find it very ironic that in contemporary Jewish scholarship, a great deal has been written about all types of human relationships, but very little has been written about the master-disciple relationship. And in my view, this is especially curious today, given our concern regarding Jewish continuity, because ultimately the key, it seems to me, to Jewish continuity is the functioning of the master-disciple relationship. So what I'm planning to do this week is to talk not only about Heschel's thought and life and works, which I could do if I were talking about any of the other thinkers I mentioned, but also to season this discussion with stories about Heschel in order to illustrate insights into his life and work. And though some of these stories, as you've already seen, may seem to be digressions from the topics being discussed, I hope that you will see that they are really aimed at clarifying the topics that we are discussing in terms of his life and thought. In Hasidic tradition, there is a teaching that when a person studies Talmud and reviews the teachings of the Talmudic masters, he or she should actually experience the presence of these Talmudic masters during their studies. And therefore, one of my goals in this course is to introduce you not only to Heschel's thought, but to Heschel himself, so that you can sense his presence, his personality, and in effect, to enter into a conversation with him. Strange as it may sound, study at its best is really a type of seance, where we try to commune with the thinkers of the past. So unlike Maimonides, whose favorite drink, I have no idea what it was. I know that Heschel's favorite drink was orange juice, which was not unusual because most Polish Jews, their favorite drink is orange juice. It's not by chance that during the Six-Day War, Poland and all the Warsaw Pact countries severed relationships with Israel and renewed them after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. And the first thing that happened between Poland and Israel is that Poland became the biggest importer of Jaffa oranges. Because Poles like their orange juice. So I know what his favorite drink was. I know what his favorite cigar was. I know what how tall he was, how his voice sounded, how his accent sounded. But what is important in studying him, which I want to focus on, since very few people can do this, is the relationship between his life and his thought. I have a student now who's finishing a doctorate here, and she wrote about a Holocaust writer, author, and one of the readers said that she spent too much time writing about the author and his life and his life's relationship to his work, and not enough time on the work, on the literature itself. And I disagree with this, because you have to see the whole thing as a package, and you have to see how it all fits together. Today, many people who are dealing with Heschel's thought tend to create Heschel in their own image. They make him what they want him to be. And for that reason, if you look at these different images, you seem to have a schizophrenic personality, because they're not looking at what is it that binds all these different facets of this multifaceted person together. And that's what I'm concerned with. What is the cohesive element that binds all of the facets of Heschel's life and work together? Now, for example, Heschel's chair at the Jewish Theological Seminary was not in Jewish philosophy and not in Jewish theology. There are reasons for that. The reason was that usually the chancellor has the chair in Jewish theology. It's a custom that was established by Salman Schechter. Why they didn't give him the chair in Jewish philosophy, I don't know. But the chair that he had from 1945 to 1972 was the chair in Jewish ethics and mysticism. It's a strange combination, ethics and mysticism. It's a title he got already in the 40s. But when you think about it, it was a very apropos title, Ethics and Mysticism, because from the example I gave before with the segregation of God, you can already see that for him there was an interweaving of ethics and mysticism, that his views on moral issues, on social ethics, came out of the mystical tradition of which he was a part. Okay, are there any questions to this point? Is all that clear? Really? Okay. All right, now I'll begin to say a few things about his biography. And I'll begin at the end. December 23rd, 1972. The last day of his life. It was Shabbat. Friday night, he had guests for dinner. See if you know these names. Joseph Wiseman and Pearl Lang. Anybody ring a bell? Joseph Wiseman and Pearl Lang.
Oh.
Lang. L-A-N-G. They were not scholars. They were both in the arts. Well, you know who these people are, you just don't know the ring of the bell with the name. Joseph Wiseman was a Canadian Jewish actor, came out of the Yiddish theater, and went to Hollywood, and made a number, and was the supporting actor in a number of very famous movies. For example, Viva Zapata with Marlon Brando. He played a Jewish mafioso in the television series Crime Story, and his most famous role was as the first Bond villain, Dr. No. And if you saw him, you'd recognize him. Pearl Lang was a protege of the great choreographer Martha Graham, and was herself a great choreographer. And she was the mentor, I don't know if there's a female that she mentored, nobody knows, a little Catholic girl from Detroit who is now known to the world as Madonna. So I've often thought all these years, what if they had brought Madonna that night to meet Heschel? And that would have been her first exposure to Kabbalah. How it all would have been different. So, Wiseman came dressed as he was very theatrical in a cape. So he and Heschel were practicing wearing this cape. And that's at Shabbos dinner, and that was the last evening. And then he went to bed and fell asleep and died in his sleep. The next morning was Shabbat, so they couldn't call anybody. Or they certainly couldn't call anybody Jewish. So his wife called their friend, who I'll talk about later, the Jesuit priest Daniel Berrigan, who he was involved with in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I think Berrigan is still alive.
Yeah,
one is and one isn't.
Yeah, Daniel is alive. Philip died. Philip left the priesthood and married a former nun. But Daniel, I think, is still alive on the Upper West Side of New York, writing poetry and dealing with AIDS patients. Anyway, so told him. Now, the plan was that they were going to be leaving Sunday morning to go to Mrs. Heschel's family for vacation in Los Angeles. And they were planning to make a stop on Sunday morning with Elie Wiesel in Chicago to attend and for Heschel to officiate at a wedding of one of his disciples, namely me. So what do you do in such a situation? You look in the Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
And Talmud says if there is a funeral cortege and a wedding cortege and they come to a corner at the same time, which one makes room for the other one? The wedding always goes forward. So our wedding was exactly the same time as the funeral in New York. The wedding was here, the funeral was there. And Wiesel, of course, didn't come because he was at the funeral. And at the funeral, I heard, I know, as they were lowering the coffin, it started to open up. And he started to fall out. And there are all kinds of prohibitions against moving a corpse in Jewish law for Jews. So two of the non-Jews who were there, namely Berrigan and Heschel's last student, who was Japanese, Jacob Teshima, jumped into the grave to make sure that the coffin, that he didn't fall out and that the coffin would stabilize and they could go ahead with the funeral. Very eerie from what I was told. Teshima, who I strangely never met, today is a real estate agent in Tokyo, and wrote what I consider to be, what was his dissertation with Heschel, the best book on Buddhism and Judaism. He wrote a book on Buddhism and Hasidism. Remarkable book because he knew the original sources in the original language. There are a lot of books out now on Buddhism and Judaism, but I don't think most of the people who write them know the original sources, and certainly not in the original languages. And here, Teshima knew at least the Japanese and Buddhist traditions cold, and Hasidic literature cold. Just a remarkable but a little-known book. It's a small book. Just a remarkable book. Anyway, so he was at the funeral. So that's the last day. Now, a few days before the last day, Heschel went up to Connecticut because Dan Berrigan's brother, Philip, who had been a priest, was getting out of jail. He was put in jail for destroying selective service files, the draft files, because he poured duck blood over the selective service files in Connecticut. So he was getting out of jail. And Heschel wasn't in very good health to begin with. He had had a massive heart attack in Labor Day 1969, from which I don't think he ever really recovered, and had an angina most of his life. The curse of Polish Jews, angina. And died at the age of 65. So it's just astounding when you think about all he accomplished in that time. And I remember very vividly in the 1980s, about 10 or 12 years later, after Heschel died, Mordechai Kaplan died. I didn't know Kaplan well, but I had met him a few times. And Kaplan died at 102. And I often wonder, what might Heschel have accomplished if he had lived till 102? Or even longer than 65. Because he looked a lot older than he was. But what might he have accomplished if he had lived longer than he did? So he didn't really outlive too many of his nemesis. Now, since I mentioned Kaplan, let me mention that Heschel hardly ever, I'll put it another way, Heschel is constantly polemicizing in his works against other people, but hardly ever tells you who they are. You have to know. So, for example, in his book, The Earth is the Lord's, he has a phrase that he uses in others of his books, where he says, Judaism is the art of surpassing civilization. So Held would say, this is self-transcendence, this is transcendence. No, it's an attack on Kaplan, that Judaism is a civilization. He says, no, it's surpassing a civilization. Only once did he specifically attack a view he didn't agree with. And that was a review of his book, The Sabbath, where the reviewer suggested that he disagreed with Einstein's philosophy of time. He attacked the reviewer, and in some editions of his book, The Sabbath, this is published as an afterword. It was originally an article in Judaism magazine, but otherwise, you hardly ever see him attacking his adversaries by name. For example, almost his whole book, The Man is Not Alone, or at least the first half of the book, is an attack on Buber. Never mentions Buber. You see, Buber, I have to tell you, Mordecai Kaplan, I once asked him a question about Buber, and he said to me, Buber, why do you mention Buber? He says, you know what Buber is? I said, what is Buber? Professor Kaplan, he says, he's the Amaretz, he's the Kohen Gadol of the Amaretz. He's the high priest of the ignoramuses. That's Buber. But Buber was very popular in those days. So, Buber, as you know, developed this whole idea, this whole basic philosophy called the I-thou, where each person is the I, and we're in search of the thou, to enter into a dialogue with the other person, and that's the authentic relationship, as opposed to the inauthentic relationship, which is to enter into some, he doesn't call it a relationship, but some kind of, I don't know, association with the it. There's the I-it and the I-thou. And we want to have I-thou relationships with people, not I-its, and God is the ultimate thou, the eternal thou. Now, Buber, as you know, wrote a lot about Hasidism. Mm-hmm. So, of course, a lot of Buber's interpreters, like the late Professor Maurice Friedman, who didn't know very much about Judaism. He was raised as a Quaker, why would he? Maurice said Buber got his idea of the I-thou from Hasidism. It's nonsense. Along comes Heschel, and Heschel doesn't say Buber got it backwards, but he writes this whole polemic against him. What's the polemic? God is the I, and we are the thou. It's God in search of man. The action starts with God. God is the I. Now, if Hell knew anything about Hasidism, he would say that real Hasidim, and you don't meet too many of them, certainly not these Lubavitch characters running around. My test of a real Hasid, which is their test, a real Hasid will never use the word I. Because as soon as you use the word I, you're committing the ultimate sin, which is egoism, pride. Baal Shem Tov himself said, pride is the worst sin. Pride is idolatry. So that's why you have to transcend the I. You can't focus on the I. So for Hasidism, only God is I. What's the first word of the Ten Commandments? I. Who is the I? God. I am the Lord your God. The Shema, everybody says, oh, it's the most famous Jewish prayer. It's not a prayer at all. Who's being addressed? Us. We're being addressed. We're the recipients. We're not the speakers. We're the listeners. God is the I. God is beginning that dialogue. So for Heschel, God is the I. Human beings are never the I. Everything starts with God. So Buber had it backwards. Actually, Rosenzweig had it like Heschel had it, but he didn't know why he had it that way. I mean, he had it that way because it's in the Bible, where God speaks to Adam. He didn't have it that way because he was a chassid. He didn't know anything about Hasidus Rosenzweig. So when you read Heschel, you have to sort of try to figure out who is he polemicizing against. When you read, for example, his book, Who is Man?, which is probably his most philosophical book, he gives you hints to who he's polemicizing against. He's polemicizing against Camus, he's polemicizing against Heidegger, he's polemicizing against Buber, he's polemicizing against Kant, he's polemicizing against all the big names that everybody was paying obeisance to in the intellectual circles of the 50s and 60s. Because his views were very different than theirs. And that's why in this little book on Heschel, I stole a phrase that is used to describe the Protestant theologian Karl Barth and use it for Heschel. That he was like a person throwing firecrackers in the playgrounds of the theologians. That he was upsetting the apple cart by introducing ideas that were totally different than theirs. But you really can't understand those ideas without understanding that they are part of his quest for authentic Jewish thinking. So these are not simply ideas that are coming out of nowhere. These are rather ideas that are coming out of the depths of Jewish learning, which was not the case with Rosenzweig, and was not really the case with Buber, who believed that Judaism stopped with the Bible and started again with the Hasidim, and left out everything in the middle. And it's interesting what and who Heschel leaves out, even though he obviously knew the medieval Jewish philosophical tradition very well. You don't see him suggesting that this is terribly important. And he's obviously right. I mean, if you eliminated from the history of Judaism most of the great medieval Jewish philosophers, would it change anything? I mean, if Chazdai Ibn Kreskis never lived, would it have changed anything? And Maimonides, the great superstar, the supernova of Jewish thought, the question is he more a bother than a help? Or I would put it this way, is he more an anomaly than a foundational Jewish thinker? I find him more an anomaly that messed up a lot of stuff that the mystics had to get us back to. But that's a whole other discussion. But you still have no questions about any of this, huh? Okay.
Byron, are you claiming that Heschel only wrote in opposition to others? only wrote polemiциsts?
No. I'm just suggesting that he didn't usually, or almost all the time, did not identify the people he was polemicizing against. So readers miss that aspect of his work. No, I'm not suggesting that at all.
You couldn't ask him if he could insult them. Or embarrassed.
Well, some of them he could.
Can I ask about the Kunolam?
You must. May have to embarrass you.
Because I'm not especially, I agree with you that it's overused and the role that it plays in a lot of certain circles. So I'm not defending that, but I'm really asking, right before you spoke about that, you spoke about it was big for him. What does biblical story mean now? So couldn't a response be that even though Tikkun Olam starts in the legal discussion in Talmud, what it means now is this? If someone who believed more in making Tikkun Olam the central of all Jewish life than I do, if someone were to say, why couldn't they say to you, Heschel says, what does the biblical story mean now? What does Tikkun Olam mean now?
Because it's what in philosophy is called a category mistake.
Okay.
It means that you're using a term that is irrelevant to a problem to describe the problem. I have much better terms to describe the problem. And by what the biblical story means now, I'll give you an example. In class, some students were discussing some obtuse issue with kashrut relating to Passover. And Heschel interrupted them and said, they were discussing whether something that Sephardic Jews eat on Passover is really kosher. It was really an issue of custom. It wasn't an issue of law to begin with anyway. So he interrupted them and he said, what about the atomic bomb? Is the atomic bomb kosher? That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. And that brings me right to what I have an article coming out in the Journal of Jewish Political Science on Tikkun Olam, in which I'm going to show that the way it's being used today has no relationship whatsoever to the way it was originally intended. I mean, as a writer, I'm very sensitive to language, maybe oversensitive. But when I hear some of these things, it really grates on my ear. The other thing I don't like is the word awesome.
Yeah. Great loss.
I saw a commercial last night where it's a commercial for some kind of toothpaste. My dental hygienist is awesome. And I'm thinking about sitting in shul and Yom Kippur, God is great and awesome. That's when you use the word awesome. And Yom Kippur, talk about God, not your dental hygienist. So.
I heard some Sidurim where they were conservative or something was thinking of dropping that word because of how it's been so trivialized.
Well, there are so many more problems with the conservative Nazis. Anyway, so so speaking of the atomic bomb, that brings me back to the end of Heschel's life, because what he was involved with then was the Vietnam War. And one of the big issues, as you may know, already in '64, when Goldwater ran, was whether to use tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam. One of the last things Heschel did before he died was to do something that he had never done before, and that was to endorse a political candidate during the presidential elections of the fall of 1972. And he endorsed George McGovern. And this is the letter he sent out. I'll just read you part of it. He says, if the prophets Isaiah and Amos were to appear in our midst, would they accept the corruption in high places, the indifferent way in which the sick, poor, and old are treated? Would they condone the indifference to gun control legislation that has allowed some of our finest national leaders to be shot dead? Would not our prophets be standing with those who protest against the war in Vietnam, the decay of our cities, the hypocrisy and falsehood that surround our present administration, even at the highest level? This is, of course, all before the Watergate Committee. George McGovern's call for a revival of our national values echoes the demands of Israel's ancient prophets. By word and deed, Senator McGovern is committed to the idea that setting the moral tone of this nation is the most serious responsibility of the President. Regrettably, the same cannot be said of Mr. Nixon. Now, after Heschel died, instead of going on a honeymoon, I went to New York, and we started meeting, people around the seminary family who knew Heschel at the end. And my wife pointed out to me that they all seemed very guilty because they were guilty about how they treated him at the end. And a lot of it had to do with politics. A lot of it had to do with the whole Nixon business and with the war. Now, let me give you one example. That's one of my other close teachers, the late Professor Seymour Siegel, who was later to give the invocation at Nixon's second inaugural. And who later became very close to Jerry Ford, and then later to Reagan, and who was actually the one who came up with the idea of the Holocaust Museum, but that's a whole other story. Now, Seymour was a great scholar and a very avant-garde thinker. He was one of the first people in bioethics, Jewish bioethics, one of the first people in teaching Kabbalah in an organized way. He was just ahead of everybody. And he was what they used to call in New York in the 60s a liberal who got mugged. A liberal who got mugged is called a conservative. And here's a guy who, when they founded the Jewish Theological Seminary in Buenos Aires, learned Spanish in 6 months to go down there to teach in Spanish. And then came back to New York and ran for, in the Democratic primary for Congress, in in mostly a Puerto Rican neighborhood where he gave all his speeches in Spanish and lost. And then after the Nixon business, during Nixon times, he became a conservative and was one of Nixon's last defenders. So he was also had been a disciple of Heschel's in the 40s, and there was a lot of guilt running around there. But he was convinced that Heschel was wrong about Vietnam. And at the time, I thought he was crazy, and now I'm not so sure. Because there were a lot of other things going on that I'm not sure how sure Heschel knew. And I'm not sure how naive he might have been. For example, a lot has come out recently. I mean, Vietnam was really Lyndon Johnson's war. And a lot has come out recently on Johnson and the Jews. And I find a lot of it absolutely shocking. For example, material has come out now suggesting that Johnson's great-grandparents were Jews. That the Baines family the maternal side of the Baines family were originally named Ament, which is a very well-known German Jewish name. And we know that Johnson, when he was a congressman, was breaking the immigration laws, saving Jews from Poland. We also know that when Johnson and his wife moved to Washington, after he was elected to Congress, one of the other congressmen in the Texas delegation said to his wife, asked his wife where they want to live in Washington, and she said, well, Lyndon wants to live around Connecticut Avenue. And the congressman said, you can't live there, that's where the Jews live. And she said, no, that's why he wants to live there. And then I read a testimonial of this rabbi in, I think it was Virginia, who officiated at the conversion of Lyndon Johnson's granddaughter. And he talks about sitting in the mikveh while the conversion was going on with Lady Bird Johnson. And he asked Lady Bird Johnson, what would the president have thought about his granddaughter converting to Judaism? And he quotes Lady Bird Johnson as saying, Lyndon would have been pleased that she returned to the faith of her forefathers. I have all these documents at home in a file somewhere. Now, all this is really irrelevant, except that we know now, which we didn't know then, by then I meant in late in 72 when Heshcel died, that in 1967, during the Six-Day War, the Soviets, I mean, we know that they had MiGs in Syria. We know that they had Russian pilots flying MiGs in the Six-Day War, during the Six-Day War in Syria, from Syria. But what we didn't know until it became declassified is that the Russians, the Soviet Union, had threatened to bomb Israel's nuclear reactors in Dimona. with the MiGs. And we know now that Johnson told them, don't you dare. And they did. In other words, that Johnson played a big role in the Six-Day War, which no one ever talked about before. Now, what does all this have to do with Heschel in Vietnam? It has to do with Heschel in Vietnam because during the Vietnam War, the Johnson administration, after '67, let it be known very clearly that any activity in the Jewish community against the war in Vietnam was activity against U.S. support of Israel. That the two were intertwined. And we know now, which we didn't know then, that there were Israeli military people in Vietnam advising us on what? On how to fight against the Soviets' most advanced plane that we didn't know how to fight against, namely the MiG. Because the Israelis were the only ones who had fought against the MiGs. And later, as you know, they captured one from Iraq. And I remember hearing in meetings myself in those days, but they didn't spell out the whole story, that Johnson and later Nixon viewed support of Vietnam and support of Israel as intertwined. That you couldn't be for one and against another. You had to be either for both or against both. And therefore, tremendous pressure came down on the people, especially the leadership in the Jewish community, the American Jewish community, who were opposing the war because this was considered harmful to the Israeli cause.
So
I don't know how much Heschel knew about that. Yeah.
So, is that why there weren't many Jewish organizations involved with CALC?
No, I don't think that had to do with it.
Because CALC came together to fight Vietnam.
I don't think that had to do with it. I think that this was another issue. And the other issue was that Jews didn't want to be against an American war because they would be accused of being unpatriotic or something like that. I don't think the lack of support of the Vietnam War in the Jewish community had anything to do with it. I mean, Jews were still not, comfortable here. They didn't want to, oppose the president. They didn't want to oppose a war. But the two were, in fact, interlocked, as far as the two administrations were concerned. And I'm not sure how much Heschel was aware of that.
Do you think it
Now,
would
to this, let me finish the thought. Now, Siegel argued, and he ended up being right. He said, if we, it's not, totally, good that we're involved in this war. But if we pull out of Vietnam, he said, the North is going to win, and they're going to make a genocide on the South Vietnamese. And there's also going to be a genocide in Cambodia. And nobody took him seriously. And it ended up that, unfortunately,
Cambodia more than
Cambodia, 2 million people, yeah, but Vietnam, big massacre too. So in the end, you know, he was right. But nobody thought that would happen. Everybody thought it would end up being like Korea with, you know, a north and a south. Didn't expect that to happen. But it did happen. So, in other words, at the time, I thought, you know, Heschel couldn't be wrong. And I didn't take seriously the charges that